Hello everyone, today we're talking about opposition, which is quite possibly the most basic yet important and fundamental concept of pawn endgames. So let's jump straight in. You might have heard this idea of opposition being thrown around, but if you've never explored it yourself, then this video will be quite useful. So opposition is just a relationship between the kings. It's a relationship where there's one square in between the kings, and essentially, if it is black to move, white has gained opposition. In this case, white has stepped into opposition. Now, similarly, if it was white to move here and black has just grabbed opposition, that typically helps them. Now, you might be wondering, why is opposition even relevant? What is its importance? Well, here it is. In this situation, we're trying to promote our pawn. And because we've grabbed opposition, that's a good thing, because now black has to make way for our king to move either up the board if they move down, which is obviously beneficial for us, or if they move to the left or right, that gives us a way to get into the position as well. And eventually we're going to, again, grab opposition, tiptoe our way into the game, eventually promote the pawn, and win from there. Now, it is very clear that if we switch the situation, and suppose that now it was black to move, so let's just make a couple of random moves here for a second. In this situation, black has gained opposition. It is white to move. Now, again, why is that important? Well, here is why. White no longer can make forward progress. If they go to the left, trying to maybe swoop around, black will shut that idea. They're going to continue holding opposition, and if you push your pawn, you're going to see that that won't help you. Typically, it's not good to lead with the pawn. You prefer to lead with the king. We're going to explore this a little in the third example as well. But as you can see here, black continues to maintain opposition, and eventually the result is stalemate. So opposition, simple but very important. In a pawn endgame, you have a pawn, you want to promote it, go and try to find opposition. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's now apply this concept of opposition into a real position that is a little bit more tricky. So in this situation, you can see that the kings are very far apart. And so it might not seem like opposition plays a role, but indeed it does. Because here there's a concept known as distant opposition. And as you can imagine, it's basically the same idea. In opposition, we had one square in between. So when we have three squares, that is a case of distant opposition. Here we have many more squares in between. But notice this, black is on a light square. If we move our king to a light square, we now have an odd number of squares in between. We've grabbed distant opposition. If you basically just step with the kings, eventually we will grab normal opposition. So that is what signifies that we have distant opposition. And again, that is how you win. As insane as it might seem to people who have not studied opposition, if you come here, it's a draw. If you come here, it's a draw. The only winning move is to grab distant opposition. Okay, so how does this help us? Well, as I kind of mentioned, if they just tiptoe back down, again, you do not want to give them opposition. If you come to e3, they're going to grab distant opposition and they're going to hold. You need to come forward while staying on the light square and continue to grab opposition. And eventually what's going to happen is that it's going to reach a situation where they're going to have to move and let your king enter. Now, you always want to double check that by entering, you're not letting them also enter on the other side. And in this case, for example, they're actually quick enough to promote and it's a draw. So what you could do though, because you have the luxury of opposition, you just stay with the king. And again, if they come here, now they have to waste a move and we're much quicker and we win. So opposition still is indeed winning, but that's the key of this position. You want to grab distant opposition, which later will translate into normal opposition, which will allow your king into the game. Now, there are a couple more interesting situations from this position because they can move instead to f8. And now the question comes, how do we make progress? Now, notice that if you come to f3, you're now on a light square. They come to f7, they grab distant opposition, and therefore they're going to be able to hold the situation. You're not going to be able to ever enter. They're always going to block you. And so going back after they come to f8, similarly, if you come to e3, they come to e7, and once again, they gain opposition. So we don't want to come forward on these two files. Why? Because the king can oppose those two files. But notice this, the king doesn't have access to this file. We do. you come to d3. That is how you make progress here, because they can't grab opposition. If they could come to d7, it would be a draw, but they just can't. They have to come, for example, here. And again, you don't want to come here giving them opposition, but you can continue, for example, by just waiting around. And the idea is they can't make any forward progress because we're going to grab the relevant opposition. And similarly, if they move to the left or right, we're going to go the other direction. Because again, if we come forward, they're going to be able to grab opposition no matter where we go. But we can wrap around towards the right, and they can't grab opposition because they don't control this file. This is an outflanking maneuver, where we're not going directly for them because they're the ones with the luxury of grabbing opposition here, but we're flanking them from the right where they don't have the ability to preserve the opposition. So, simple, but eventually, let's say they come here, for example, we can already we've made enough progress forward. If they come here, we could also come here, or again, grab opposition and win. So hopefully this kind of made a bit more sense when it comes to how you go about thinking about opposition when you have two kings. You always need to consider that when it's only a pawn endgame, how can I be the one to grab opposition? And so let's apply everything we learned to a final and biggest challenge yet, this position here. Now in this situation, we are currently up a pawn, but that is very temporary because their king is so much more active. It's about to come in, take both of the pawns, and then they're going to be the ones that are up a pawn. Now, this also, as you will see, will illustrate why we don't want this pawn to be on its starting square. Let's begin by just exploring what happens if we play the natural move, getting our king in. They're going to grab opposition, which in this case also stops us from making forward progress to defend our pawns. Eventually, they're going to take both of the pawns. Now, you might be wondering, wait, but I grabbed opposition, so even though they have that pawn, won't I be able to save the situation? No. The reason is because their pawn is on the starting square, eventually they're going to waste a move with that pawn. They have the space to do that. And therefore, wasting this tempo will give us back the move, and we have to move away. They gain opposition. They can already start the outflanking maneuver and eventually begin promoting their pawn down the board. So this is why we don't want a pawn all the way down, because it gives them flexibility. Whether or not they currently have opposition is no longer relevant because they can always waste a tempo, or in some cases a few tempi, in order to switch the opposition so it's in their favor. So going back, what does this help us with? Well, here is what this allows us to do. We play g6. Now, they can't take with the king because now they've dragged their king back and our king is already close enough to just defend our pawn and it's an easy draw. They take with the pawn. Now we go f5. We sacrifice the second pawn. Again, we were losing the pawns anyway, so we might as well give them up, especially because we forced their pawn to go from f7 to f5, and therefore, the fact that we are going to gain opposition here is now relevant because, as you're going to see, they no longer can waste a tempo. If they come here, we go to g2, grab opposition, and in this position, if the pawn was anywhere here on the red squares, they'd be able to waste a tempo and force us to move and let the pawn run. But because we forced the pawn down the board, they don't have that luxury of wasting a move, and we're going to be able to utilize our opposition. Again, if they bring the pawn in front of the king, that is even worse. We can continue now by just waiting for them, and eventually, if you calculate correctly and play precisely, it'll be stalemate. So, a nice and simple idea. Now, I should also note, if they come to g5 here instead and not going for opposition, we can simply come to f1, and the idea is they can't continue gaining the opposition here because their pawn is in the way. If they want to make progress, they're going to have to bring their king down, and we can grab opposition like this. And if they try what we did before, to wrap around to the file that we do not touch, it's not as important here because we can just go to f2 and go directly for their pawn. This, them coming here, it doesn't do anything. And we're still going to be able to grab opposition. So ladies and gentlemen, hopefully that helped clarify the very important concept of opposition. Subscribe if you're new around here, like this video if you learned something new from it, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.